Hey, added in this post edit, this is Editor Crumbs asking you all that if you don't intend to finish the video, please skip to the timestamp on screen before you leave to answer a question I have that I asked at the end of the video. It's a key question, and any answers to it would be appreciated. So, all right, I'm gonna get to the video. Stop. I'm sorry. I don't want to bother you anymore. Bye. Name any car maker in the world. I know I'm putting you all on the spot, but literally, just name any one of them. Okay, you know, guessing a lot of Mercedes, Toyotas, Ford, either American or European, I don't know. Maybe some oddball picks like Maserati, Citroen. I bet one of you nerds named fucking, like, SsangYong or something, but I'm guessing that out of all the brands you guys thought about, no matter how niche or forgotten they are, most of them share something in common. They all come from a pretty well-known automotive market. Japan, Germany, America, Italy, Korea, the UK, France. And I know there'll be some dude in the comments. He'll be like, no, you simplistic human being. I actually thought of Fisker and like Donkervoort. I bet you don't even know what Zenvo is. Fucking dumbass. And to that guy I say, eat shit and die. Regardless, most car brands people know come from one of those 7 countries I just listed earlier. But I'm here to talk about none of those markets, and instead gush over one that basically doesn't even exist anymore. One you might have even forgotten about, where V8s reigned supreme and where there was a lot of space to use them. Australia. When talking about Australia, most people might think of the funny accents. Whoa. Their funny accents and the wildlife being satanic, and the outback. If you're like me though, which you definitely are to some extent considering you're watching this right now, then one of the very first things that comes to mind when talking about Australia is their cars. To keep it short and sweet, they were fucking sick, alright? But at a certain point in the late 2010s, it seems like they just vanished. However, the process of the death of the Australian car industry wasn't exactly hidden from plain sight, but before being a negative Nancy about car markets and bureaucracy and politicians, I figured I might as well talk about the full history, birth, life, and death included, of the 2 main names one thinks of when talking about Australia's car industry: Holden and Ford. Holden's history started well before cars were a big thing across the world. Originally, they were actually fully dedicated to leatherwork, making saddles and shit like that. That was boring, so when the car finally rolled around, Holden decided, correctly, that cars would indeed beat horses eventually. So our modern understanding of what Holden was began in 1924, with Holden's Motor Bodybuilders. Originally, they were rebodying a whole bunch of cars, including GM models, for 7 years until 1931, when GM fully bought them out. In the Great Depression, by the way, GM, always making smart financial decisions. Always. Even 95 years ago at this point. Unironically though, GM actually did do something smart and beneficial to really capitalize off of Holden. They used PR and marketing. I know it sounds pretty redundant to say in modern times where car companies seem to have a personality, especially if you're Dodge, where you say you love takeovers, and regardless. In the 1930s and 40s, using PR to actually ingratiate yourself with the people you're taking money from was quite a revolutionary idea. GM used this newfangled idea to basically make Holden the Australian company. They capitalized on Australia's newfound nationalist pride after the Great War and during World War II, which led to Holden being independent and important enough to GM that they let them make the first ever truly domestic Australian car, the Holden 48 215, or otherwise known as the Holden. From 1948 onwards, they just continued using their status as being the Aussie's car to grow even faster. The 50s saw Holden introduce the 502106, or the Holden Ute, and if you know even a little tiny bit about Australia in general, not even about cars, then you know that the Ute is quite literally the most Australian thing ever besides VB and road trains. As you can imagine, utes, which is short for utility vehicles, are extremely important in Australia as the terrain of the land is unsuitable to most living things, let alone a fucking car. Really, they're beefed up mini trucks that sort of serve the same purpose as pickups, but you don't say that out loud because bogans will skin you alive. And if you call like the actual thing where you lay shit in a ute a bed instead of a tray, the consequences are severe. This one car, the Ute, started production in 1951 and continued being produced, one way or another, until 2017. 66 years of service. The 60s and 70s only saw Holden get bigger as one of the few truly domestic and legendary Australian engines, the Iron Lion V8, which only sounds cool if you say it in the accent, began being produced in 1969 and lasted until 2000. 2 years earlier though, one of the most successful race cars of all time, the Holden Tirana, was introduced. The Tirana is a literal legend, as not only was it produced for over a decade until 1980, it was driven to 5 victories at the Bathurst 1000, most of those times being piloted by the king of the mountain, Peter Brock. The Holden Monaro was the predecessor to the Tirana, but to be honest, while it did win Bathurst twice, it just wasn't really on the same level as the Tirana, not only because it wasn't as cool, but also because it wasn't the inspiration behind the single most iconic Australian car ever. Also during the 70s, Holden opened up a new luxury brand called Statesman that sold Statesmen, and eventually turned into a state of shutdown in 1985 because they weren't really that good. But fuck that boring shit. It's time to talk about the fucking Commodore! The Commodore! Sorry, my fault. Got a little amped up there. The Holden Commodore could have an entire video dedicated to it, and it still wouldn't do the car's impact any justice, but the Commodore was introduced in 1978, replacing the well-loved Holden Kingswood, which is also a sick-ass car, becoming Holden's flagship model. The first generation of Commodore, which most prominently includes the first of the first generation, the VB, which is just awesome, just amazing irony. Maybe on purpose? Whatever. It was an absolute chart topper. While the VB itself didn't win any Bathurst 1000s, its direct successors did throughout the 80s, as the Commodore became the winningest car in the decade, taking 6 wins. Even if the last 2 were from the next generation, but still 4 wins. However, this period of time wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows for Holden, or, for the entirety of the Australian car market. As a matter of fact, the one thing that kickstarted the downfall of the Australian auto industry was introduced in the 80s. The button plan. I'll explain later what the button plan was, but to explain what it did in layman's terms to the entire domestic market, it basically made Australian-made cars more expensive than they should have been. Yeah, we'll get back to that. And I know some Australians who love cars, they hear the button plan. It's like the same thing in like America when you say Pearl Harbor. But getting back on point, it was the button plan that actually made one of the first gen Commodores, the VL, be quite hated, as it was the first Commodore to not have a GM/Holden derived engine, instead having a Nissan RB30 straight 6, which in retrospect, it's not that bad, alright? That's pretty fucking good. But it did take away from the whole Australia's car company brand they had going on. The button plan even spawned the Holden Chimera, which might have been one of the worst financial flops of any GM product ever, which is saying something. It was in 1987, by the way, that Holden also took full control of their motorsports, making Holden Special Vehicles, or HSV, to take over the operations of Holden Dealer Team, or HDT, which ran the previously mentioned Tiranas, Monaros, and Commodores until 1986, and was out of commission after the whole energy polarizer fuckery that happened with Peter Brock and all that. Very weird. Things were starting to trend up by 1988 as the new second generation of Commodores began with the VN, where the engine options immediately solidified it as being a rock-solid generation of cars, as the VN could be optioned with the Buick 3800 or the Iron Lion. So you get a cool-ass Australian V8, or you get, like, the 5th greatest engine ever made. I wouldn't be that upset, you know? The public forgave Holden's missteps throughout the mid-80s once these came out, but in 1989, everything came crashing back down as Holden and Toyota Australia merged in alignment with the button plan to create United Australian Automobile Industries. This move was one of the biggest factors in Holden's collapse, this specific move. And it really was the spurring cause behind them shutting down. But again, I'm not supposed to get into the shitty stuff yet, so let's keep it going. The 90s started off poorly for Australian manufacturers as the government lowered tariffs on imported vehicles, making them a lot cheaper than domestic cars, and sort of pushed them out of line. Wasn't I supposed to be fucking positive? God damn, I'm a shitty scriptwriter. The Commodore still held strong as new, frankly, boring models of Holden's came out throughout the 90s. The only interesting change being they changed the name of full-size Commodores to Statesmans or Caprices. The models of second-gen Commodores didn't change much until the VR Commodore in 1993. That finally introduced the twin kidneys, the grille design that would be used for all Commodores until 2002, and was the continued design for all HSV cars until the division's end. 1997 saw the introduction of the third generation Commodore, which had revolutionary independent rear suspension. Yeah, first one to have independent rear suspension was 1997. I find that pretty funny. Which really did actually differentiate it from its main competitor, a car and rivalry we'll be talking about soon enough. And finally, in 1999/2000, the Iron Lion V8 was retired after 3 decades of service. Its replacement an LS1, so you can't be that upset. I'm gonna be honest, you really can't be upset about that. In motorsports, Holden was still the winningest manufacturer of the decade, with 6 wins at Bathurst and many, many more in the ATCC, or Australian Touring Car Championships, which was the predecessor to supercars, or V8 supercars as we know it. But that's not to say that they were the most dominant cars. I know it sounds contrived, but the R32, otherwise known as Godzilla by this time, embarrassed pretty much every car it ever competed against in every series across the world ever, including the ATCC. To the point that the Group A rules it ran under died due to everyone unanimously agreeing that they were getting fucked hard by Nissan. Yeah, most of the 90s weren't the best for Holden, but from 1999 to 2005, it was almost as if they had a golden age of cars. The last real period of success they would ever truly have. The 2000s were a decade of ups and downs for Holden, as it marked some of the highest highs the company has ever had and the start of the lowest low. In 2000, the tariffs on foreign cars were lowered even more by the government, which led to Holden losing their top seller spot to Toyota in 2003 and losing over half of their market share in the country by 2006. But during that same time, the 3rd gen Commodore stayed strong, not really changing much other than introducing a Commodore Ute, the single most Australian car of all time, as well as HSV becoming a lot more popular as their models began outputting ridiculous lap times, power figures, and tire costs. Holden reintroduced the Monaro, which was now a 2-door Commodore, and funnily enough, it seemed to be much more successful outside Australia than within Australia. Some other names for the Holden Monaro are the Vauxhall Monaro, which was surprisingly praised by Top Gear in the UK, and the Pontiac GTO, which is just absolutely adored here in North America. The last ever truly bespoke Holden engine, the high-feature V6, was introduced in the VZ Commodore in 2004, and the next year, Holden began selling Daewoo's instead of Opels, which might have been the second worst fucking idea ever. But what else do you expect from good old GM? The 4th gen Commodore was introduced in 2006, and I know this sounds weird, was the first fully domestic Commodore. That's right, all Commodores before the VE were derivatives of an Opel chassis, meaning the most Australian car ever wasn't actually 100% indigenous to Australia. It just claimed to be. That sounds familiar. The VE Commodore was a massive step up compared to all previous Commodores, and really all Australian market cars in general. The quality of the build was better, it was faster, it looked amazing. Really, it seemed as if Holden, even though these tough times were, not really letting up, it seemed as if Holden was trending up. The 2010s were marred by the financial crisis for Holden, with the only positive thing being the introduction of the VF Commodore, the last real Commodore ever produced. At least they went out with a bang though, cause god damn. Not only did it look better, it just was better, meaning all variants of the Commodore like the Monaro and HSV's offerings got better too. But unfortunately, Holden was literally puking money non-stop. In the early 2010s alone, Holden was given $810 million in subsidies. On top of wage cuts, workers willingly taking wage freezes at certain plants, and getting $150 million in subsidies since 2004. The company was living off borrowed time, and the clock was ticking about a billion times faster than they could afford. So, on October 20th, 2017, Holden ceased all domestic production, ending the legacies of the Commodore, Monaro, and HSV's just batshit creations. They would become an importer of GM cars from the US, Korea, Britain, Canada, etc. from here on out. Also, they brought back the Commodore in 2018, but it just wasn't a Commodore, it was fraudulent. I think it was a Chevy Malibu, which is just sinful because a Chevy Malibu is a fucking horrible car. And I think that was a pretty easy sign to see what was going to happen soon. So, sure as shit, on February 17th, 2020, after 96 years of service, Holden was retired by GM. The company shutting down and being replaced by Chevrolet from that point onwards. And somehow this wasn't the worst thing to happen to Australia in 2020. The company left one hell of a legacy behind, being the winningest manufacturer at Bathurst with 36 wins, and the winningest manufacturer in V8 supercars / the ATCC with 617 wins. I'm pretty sure the next guys up are like 250 wins behind. Just ridiculous. Complete and total domination. As I've alluded to multiple times already, the downfall of Holden can pretty easily be attributed to the button plan. Most people outside of Australia have no clue what the button plan is. And neither did I before I decided I wanted to know why Australia doesn't make cars anymore. The Button Plan was a motion put forward by the Australian government in the 80s that made it mandatory for Australian manufacturers to collaborate with foreign companies in order to share their cars as rebadged versions under the other company. The goal behind this? Well, almost every source says it was to have less protections for Australian manufacturers and limit their model lineups to 6 cars in order to diversify the market. But the consumer base never complained about high import tariffs on foreign cars. Pretty much all of them being Japanese at this point, so I'll just refer to them as Japanese cars. Most people seemed content with buying Australian-made cars or buying Japanese-made cars that had tariffs on them, but they were so cheap that they just costed the same as an Australian car anyways. But the guy who suggested the plan, John Button, a senator, wanted to make the car industry more efficient, in quotes. So basically, the Button Plan was purpose-made to dismantle the Australian auto industry to accommodate cheaper Japanese cars without putting high tariffs on them. It's basically sabotage, alright? It's sabotage of your own country's domestic manufacturing. I'm no nationalistic guy. Matter of fact, I think nationalism is fucking stupid. But why the fuck would you purposely nuke your domestic manufacturing that people had no problem with at all to appease some foreign country's manufacturers? The Japanese cars were either cheaper than or the same price as Australian cars, even with the tariffs. So why did you do this? Well, I hate to say it, but in the long run, the plan had some credence to it. At the time it was introduced, though, it might have been one of the worst ideas I've ever seen any politician make ever. And let me tell you, that's a very, very competitive list. There's some pretty bad people. Have you ever heard of Rob Ford?
Olivia gone that says that I wanted to get her pussy. I'm happily married.
But fast forward to the 2000s when domestic manufacturing really began to cost more than the companies made, the Button Plan began to make sense. Australia is a big country, but it's not a big country. 28.5 million people as of 2026, less back then. That couldn't sustain a full-fledged auto industry in the modern day. They tried in Canada, didn't work. Acadian died within like 3 years or something like that, I'm pretty sure. But in the 1980s, it definitely could have. I mean, it fucking did. Even through the Button Plan, it did. No matter which way you spin it, Holden was destined to fail at some point because of Australia's population. That's indisputable. The Button Plan, however, accelerated this failure as the cars made in collaboration with Japanese manufacturers were like poison to the base of Holden. Extremely proud, patriotic, or just flat out nationalist Aussies. They lost so much money to cars like the Chimera. I cannot quantify how bad it was. It was horrible. So yeah, the Button Plan led to disillusioned consumers who were upset with this slop that Holden was making in the 80s and eventually capitulated to Japanese imports as they got cheaper and cheaper relative to the rising costs of domestic Holdens as tariffs were continuously lowered on them. And to the GM executive watching this video, don't think I forgot about what you did. Fuck you. Fuck you. GM butchered Holden's name after the 80s, and the failure of the Button Plan to do anything useful at all by focusing on having rebadged Opels, Chevys, and Daewoo's sold under Holden rather than letting them develop new domestic vehicles. The shitboxes GM made in Cleveland and Kunshan were the most aggressively marketed Holdens, as they were equal or lesser in quality to the Japanese cars while also being just as or more expensive, which makes zero fucking sense. GM's mishandling of everything they touch was a factor in the failure of Holden as well, but really, it was the Button Plan's fallouts that sealed the deal. If the Button Plan had been introduced in the 2000s, do I think it might have actually stretched the lifespan of Australian manufacturing? I don't know, I'm not an economist. So with one half of the Australian auto industry now explained in full, it's time we learn about the other half, where in reality it was really only like one car keeping them afloat. But my God, was it one hell of a vehicle. Ford's introduction to Australia came a year after Holden's, yet funnily enough, wasn't under the direction of Detroit, rather Windsor in Ontario, Canada. The worst fucking place in the world. You literally live in Detroit without the benefits of living in Detroit. Why would you live in Windsor? Just a horrible fucking place. See, a smart guy like me, I live in London, Ontario, for sure. You know, just the greatest city ever. Ford Australia was originally an outpost of Ford Canada, which was quite an important distinction back then, as Ford had separate entities controlling the Canadian division and the American division. This meant that the creation of Ford Australia prompted Ford to have yet another separate entity controlling this division across the Pacific, which made Ford Australia bespoke from the main company even though they were selling complete knockdown kits of the Model T in 1925. The Geelong plant, where Ford Australia made their entry into the country, is extremely culturally relevant to the city where it gets its namesake. The Geelong Cats, the tied for oldest Australian football team, shared with the Melbourne Football Club, which, hey, they used to show Australian football on TSN here. Australian football is fucking hard. I like it. I fuck with it. They just don't show it anymore, and I don't know why, but if I could watch it, I would. Yeah, the Geelong Cats have been sponsored by the Geelong plant / Ford Australia since 1925, making it the oldest continuous sponsorship in the entire world. Anyways, the history of Ford Australia is surprisingly not as wide-spanning as I originally thought, and even though I say that, there's actually still quite a lot to talk about, such as Ford, because I'm just going to call them Ford from here on out, actually being the first to introduce the coupe utility vehicle, or the ute. All the way back in 1934, the first ever ute was made after the wife of a farmer asked Ford to make a vehicle for her and her family, as their farm was, expectedly, extremely fucking hard to drive on because Australia is not meant to be lived in. They needed a vehicle to go to church in on a Sunday and which can carry their pigs to market on Mondays. I tried my best. So right in the middle of the Great Depression, again, when banks labeled cars as luxuries for farmers but not trucks, Ford made a vehicle that blurred the lines between both of these, making it practical for road use and being able to carry heaps of shit and pig slop around as well. Lou Bant was the designer that made it happen, and I highly doubt that he knew his creation would be the defining archetype of car that would define his country for like 9 decades afterwards. Beyond the Ford Model A Ute though, Ford didn't really make any domestic models for the Australian market, as they realized that America and Australia have quite similar needs. And unlike GM, they don't have 1,700 companies under them. At most, they had, 3? 4? At any point that Ford Australia existed. I mean, there's lots of harsh terrain in Australia, as there is in America. There's rednecks in Australia, otherwise known as bogans. And it's big. It's a big-ass country. So, over the entire 91-year history of the company, they only made 4 domestic models. 5 if you include the Model A Ute. All but one of those models were based off of one of the other models, so yeah, the history of Ford Australia is pretty congruent. As it's based all around that one model that pretty much all the others were based off of, I think it's time we talk about it. The Ford Falcon. During the 50s, Ford was struggling as Holden really gained traction with their whole Australian car company identity and marketing they used. Ford wasn't even specific to Australia, while Holden was. Other than the Model A Ute, they had nothing that really appealed to proud Aussies. They thought about importing Canadian Windsor V8s to try and make a competitor to Holden, but the cost would be too high. In 1960, however, that changed. The first gen XK Falcon was made, based off of the North American Falcon. It was fitted with tougher suspension and axles in order to account for Australia's roads, and the Falcon 6 engine was so torquey that the axle actually needed to have a higher ratio to account for it. However, it seems like they forgot to toughen up just this small part that doesn't matter, the ball joints. So those failed pretty often. The XK Falcon was the first real competition Holden had as a company. The XP Falcon improved on a lot of faults of the XK and introduced the second ever domestic Ford, the Fairmont, which was just an upscaled Falcon. Of course, there was a Ute variant for the Falcon, which was produced in one way or another until 2016. 1966 saw the introduction of the second gen Falcon, which began with the XR and had a Windsor V8. The same engines you get in the Selby GT350 and Panteras. You got those in Panteras too. Throughout the generation, which featured the XR, XT, XW, and XY, Ford began making Cleveland 351s and Windsor 351s in Australia. Additionally, the second gen introduced the Falcon GT, which set the basis for Ford's motorsports in the country, alongside the Cortina competing in touring car events. The XY is still considered one of the best Australian cars ever made, simply because it was good everywhere. Sunday at Bathurst, Monday in showrooms. It was good. The GTHO Phase 3, dream car. I fucking love it. I have no idea why, but I love it. It's impossible to get here though, so I'm shit out of luck. The third gen Falcon was really when it became a thing of its own, as it was the first bespoke Falcon to Australia, as the NA Falcon stopped being produced in 1972. This generation overall was pretty forgettable though, as the supercar scare happened where legislators were deathly afraid of the faster and faster cars Holden and Ford were making. The Landau, which was one of their other domestic Fords, was based off the Falcon, and it was basically just the coupe version. And other than that, the only other notable thing was that the Falcon had outsold Holden for the first time, as the Kingswood was being phased out in favor of the Commodore. It took at least a small amount of time for people to get used to that, but hey, beating Holden at all, even under those circumstances, is a good sign. The good times didn't last for that long, because by 1979, the fuel crisis that started right when the third gen Falcon was introduced had passed, and new fears from governments realizing that fuel is finite made them put policies and laws into place that hampered performance cars. So the first half of the 4th Gen Falcon's production run that started in 1979 just wasn't good at all. Yes, the XB Falcon was the highest selling Falcon up to that point, but it also had no V8 offerings, the first Falcon to do so. However, the introduction of the XR6 model set the foundation for one of Ford Australia's biggest successes and allowed them to do something Holden really couldn't because of GM's rebadging: having international recognition. The 4th Gen Falcon's main production run ended in 1988 with the 5th Gen Falcon's introduction, but the Ute and panel van models were sold until 1999. The 5th Gen was really when the peak of the Falcon began, as even though Ford was under the same bullshit that Holden was regarding the button plan, they actually were faring a little better, it seemed, because a lot of Fords in Australia really were just imports from North America already. And just like Holden, Ford finally got some speed demons to lay their greasy ass, brake cleaner chapped hands on their cars, with the XR6 and XR8 models having work done on them by Tickford Vehicle Engineering, the predecessor to Ford Performance Vehicles, aka FPV. TVE might not sound like an important name, but when I mentioned that this was what ProDrive used to call themselves, some extremely nerdy racing fans might have just creamed their jeans at the thought of ProDrive working on regular ass road cars being sold for normal prices. I'll talk about FPV more in depth later though, I promise. There really isn't much to say about the 5th Gen Falcons. However, the 6th Gen Falcons can actually be summed up in even less words. Just 2 actually. The Barra. The earliest 6th Gen Falcons, the AUs made until 2002, were actually quite appealing to the buyers who liked staring at a pile of shit with flies on it, because this was during Ford's New Edge styling era. So while it worked for the Focus, I think the New Edge Focus looks nice. Jesus Christ, sales dropped hard as Ford got smoked by the Commodore, so they tightened up and released the single greatest Australian car ever made. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. Holden did not make the greatest Australian car ever made. I'm sorry to break it to you, alright? The BA and BF Falcons introduced the legendary Barra Straight 6 into the world. Also the Barra V8, which isn't actually Australian, it's Canadian, but I guess they have similar architecture or something like that. They really don't have any connection. I don't know why they called it the Barra V8. Without a doubt, this was the most successful Falcon ever, as it absolutely smoked the Commodore in sales for quite a while, as well as not only being loved in Australia, both the XR6 and XR8 models, but being world renowned for their speed on a track, especially the XR6 as it featured the Barra. I'm guessing at least some of you know how sought after these engines are, but to put it into perspective why they're so well loved. With ARP head studs and some tougher valve springs, the long block can handle up to 700 horsepower. The base engine came with around 400. This means every single component in and on the engine can take almost 300 more horsepower than it came with from the factory, without failure and while being reliable. It's insane. It's insane. The Barra alone would make the 6th Gen Falcon worth buying, but with the more simple styling, the price to performance ratio, the reliability, it's one of the most well-rounded cars ever made. And it was limited to only being sold to the luckiest 25 million people in the world and the Kiwis. The only negative part about the BA and BF Falcons run, though, was the last ever Falcon wagons were made in this era, which is a shame. Wagons are the coolest thing ever, and I will have a video talking about wagons one day. Also, the only non-Falcon based fully domestic Ford and the last domestic Ford ever introduced, the Territory, started production in 2004. The 7th Gen Falcon began its run in 2008. A perfect year to start new business ventures. The FG Falcon was extremely advanced compared to all its forefathers, as practically every model was worked on in some part by FPV, who I should probably talk about now because, my god, are they the most underrated special division in the world. FPV was created in 2002 after the success Tickford/ProDrive had tuning Falcons in the Supercars Championship and at Bathurst for years prior. ProDrive merged with Ford officially to create the division, and they've been responsible for some of the fastest cars to ever come out of Australia, and in general some of the fastest road cars in the world. The XR6 and XR8 were official Ford models, but FPV also had dealers that would sell their bespoke models like the GS, GT, and Pursuit, which are all fucking awesome, by the way. Prior to Ford Performance Racing, which was the racing division of the high-powered street cars division of Ford. Fords were of course successful at Bathurst and in the ATCC/supercars, with privateers like Dick Johnson Racing being the winningest Ford team in the history of the ATCC/supercars, as well as the longest running, still operating after 46 years since being founded in 1980. But once FPR took over in 2003, Ford won Bathurst twice in 2013 and 2014, and won the Supercars chip in 2015. The last win Ford Australia took when they were still domestically manufacturing. Back to the road-going Falcon, FPV didn't only contribute to the XR6 and XR8 models this time, as I mentioned earlier. They also worked on the G Series, which included the G6 and the G6E, which were luxury variants that retired the Fairmont name, as well as the base model Falcon. Eventually, as the end was coming near, the XR8's anticipated domestic V8 was cancelled, and therefore the model itself was cancelled. And FPV eventually closed shop in 2014 when Ford Australia was starting to wind down. The final Falcon, the FGX, marked the end of a 56-year run of the name. The Falcon was celebrated as the FGX had a bunch of commemorative and special models to give the Falcon and the whole of Ford Australia's domestic manufacturing as a whole a proper goodbye. On October 7th, 2016, after 88 years, Ford Australia bowed out of production. From 2006 to 2012, the company experienced over $1 billion in losses, which likely got much higher from 2012 to 2016 as imported SUVs became so much more common and saloons, wagons, and even utes began falling out of favor in the mass consumer's eye. So, just as with Holden, the button plan did indeed affect Ford's domestic production for all the same reasons as earlier. However, Ford Australia, while in my personal belief, making equally good or better cars than Holden, never was seen as Australia's car company, so sharing platforms with other manufacturers wasn't as sacrilegious to do for them as it was for Holden. The overarching idea of too little a population with too much competition that was much cheaper than what they were offering was, again, the main cause behind Ford Australia's domestic shutdown. Everything I said regarding the button plan in the Holden section remains here, so there's no point in making this video any longer than it should be. Especially because I just reached the fucking 45-minute mark on my recording software. Some people might be surprised to learn, though, that Holden and Ford were not the only major players in Australia. What, you thought the video was going to end with me being somber as shit? Fuck you! Come on now, uncle, you know me better than that. It's time we talk about practically irrelevant history once again. Specifically, the other quintessential Australian cars. The Toyota Orion. It was just Australia's Avalon. It was a Camry with more luxury and a little more power. It was never a real competitor to Holden and Ford in terms of iconicness, fanfare, or speed, but it did have some performance models like the TRD and the Sportivo ZR6, which were surprisingly fast. Toyota Australia also made a whole bunch of Camry derivatives specifically for Australia, but I mean, they really are just Camrys, so there's not much to talk about. The Chrysler Valiant was Chrysler's attempt to break into Australia. Its two biggest rivals were in a unique market that was similar to America's and were profiting off of that market big time. The Valiant was Chrysler's attempt at fighting the Kingswood and Falcon in the late 60s and early 70s, and it actually won Wheels' Car of the Year award, the biggest Australian automotive magazine, by the way. It actually won their Car of the Year award, which is ridiculous. The Valiant Charger was a two-door model that ended up being just like a Chrysler Mustang or Camaro. However, oil crisis, 1973, they left as the Japanese became a lot more favored. They did come back in the 90s and they lasted until 2021, but there's a reason you don't hear anything about it. It was just typical Chrysler. Mitsubishi ended up being Chrysler's replacement pretty much, and placing a Japanese company to be your outlet for your cars was a better idea than having to transport them 16,000 kilometers across the Pacific. So this was under the directive of Diamond Star Motors, I think. Cars like the Mitsubishi Sigma, Magna, and Verada were some of the more notable cars, but the Mitsubishi 380 was the coolest, as it was a move into the Australian saloons market, competing against the Commodore and Falcon, while being front-wheel drive. It sold decently well, but that Aussie factor just wasn't there, so yeah. Mitsubishi is still in Australia to this day, importing all the slop dog shit that they make nowadays for people to suffer in. Finally, Nissan, of course, needed to mention. While the R31, Pulsar, Skyline, and Pintara, which was an R31 that wasn't a Skyline, were all produced in the country, nobody really gives a fuck. Just as with every other series it molested, the R32 had a significant presence in Australian motorsport for about 2 to 3 years before killing the class it raced in and leaving because financial difficulties at Nissan in 1992. In the modern day, Nissan and Renault's partnership means that both Nissans and Renaults are sold in the country, but I could think of at least 800,000 things more interesting than talking about modern day Renault and Nissan, so I'm just not going to do it. And with that, the entire history sort of the Australian auto industry has been explained. Really, it's a story that's quite unique to Australia because of a multitude of factors. From the Button plan really exacerbating the issue of domestic cars being too expensive compared to Japanese cars, while there also not being enough Australians to really keep them afloat in that position. There's also the general mismanagement of GM, the world's most evil company, beating out Palantir and Cutwater and Firestone. Firestone is weirdly evil. It all comes down to CEOs and politicians being fucking retarded. So just what a happy ending. If there's one caveat you can take from this video, I don't know, stop idolizing politicians. All of them are willing to rip out your teeth with pliers if it meant an extra $1. Something like that. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. If you made it this far, you clearly must have enjoyed something, because fuck me, this is a long video. If you did make it this far, I'm eternally thankful for your time. It means a lot that you're willing to spend your free time hearing me talk about shit I find interesting. Whether it's because you like what I'm saying, you like my personality, I don't know, both, something like that. It's appreciated. Oh yeah, hold on. Regarding that, I almost forgot. So ever since I posted the Call of Duty video, Call of Duty track video, I've realized that I have a lot of other things I'd like to talk about. Mostly Call of Duty, but also a lot of other things I'd like to do. If you go and watch some of my older videos, or you're one of my IRL friends, then why am I calling you my IRL friends? I should just call you my friends. Whatever. You'll know that this channel started out as a gaming channel that eventually turned into a fuck around with friends channel, or guess funny moments? I don't know. Something like that. But yeah, I really do wish I could do those videos again. But if I posted a video like that on my channel now, it would destroy my algorithm push and lead to a catastrophic failure of the channel. And I'm going to be honest, I like seeing this channel grow. So I'm asking you guys if you'd be fine with me making like a second channel where I can post a whole bunch of miscellaneous bullshit from here on out. I mean, with Call of Duty and GTA coming out later this year, as well as me moving out to go to uni, having a channel where I can just dick around and do whatever would be fun. It would be nice. But I wouldn't do it without at least asking if you'd be down to watch it or enjoy stuff like that. So yeah, let me know in the comments if you'd want to see that. And yeah, again, I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, that's all I got to say. I hope you enjoyed. And I hope you have a good day, night, morning, afternoon, whatever. Just have a good one, man. Have a good one.
Get wicked, damn.
Hey, ooh, we be pimpin', nigga knee alone, not a hoe, who be strippin'.